In 1959, a British engineer built a motorcycle that still outruns a modern Harley-Davidson in a straight line. The Triumph Bonneville T120 was clocked at 128 miles per hour the year Buddy Holly died. Harley's most iconic road bike today, the Street Glide, tops out at Wonder 10. This wasn't luck. It was a deliberate engineering decision made by one man, Edward Turner, who believed American motorcycles had grown fat, slow, and comfortable. In the next 20 minutes, you'll see exactly how he did it, and why Detroit never saw it coming. Most people who hear this argument for the first time laugh, and that reaction is understandable. Harley-Davidson is one of the most recognized brands on the planet. It has a mythology around it that most manufacturers would spend any amount of money to buy. It represents something to people: freedom, rebellion, a particular idea of what a motorcycle is supposed to feel like and sound like and mean, and the idea that something built in 1959 in a factory in England by a company that most people under 30 have never heard of could make that machine look slow feels almost offensive to the people who love the American brand. But feelings and facts are different things, and the facts here are genuinely extraordinary. The motorcycle we're talking about is the Triumph Bonneville T120. Built in the Meriden factory in the West Midlands of England, introduced to the world in 1959, and named after a salt flat in Utah where a Triumph motorcycle had set a world land speed record 2 years earlier. It was not designed to be comfortable. It was not designed to carry luggage across the American heartland. It was designed with complete and unambiguous intention to be the fastest production motorcycle in the world. And for a period of time that lasted longer than most people realize, that is exactly what it was. To understand why that matters, and why it still matters in a conversation about Harley-Davidson today, you have to understand what the motorcycle world looked like in 1959. Because the context is everything here. Without the context, it's just a number on a spec sheet. With the context, it's one of the most remarkable stories in the history of the internal combustion engine. The late 1950s were a complicated moment for motorcycles in America. The market was dominated by two domestic manufacturers, Harley-Davidson and Indian, and both of them were building machines according to a philosophy that had been established decades earlier and hadn't changed in any fundamental way since. Big engines, heavy frames, low revving torque, the kind of motorcycle that feels enormously powerful when you're sitting still and makes a sound that carries for a mile in every direction. What those machines were not built for was outright speed. They were built for presence, for experience, for a particular feeling of riding that their owners were deeply and genuinely devoted to, and which is absolutely real and absolutely valid as a reason to ride a motorcycle. But speed, in the sense of how fast a machine will travel from one point to another, was never the primary objective. It was almost beside the point. Triumph understood this, and Triumph decided with a clarity of purpose that I find quite admirable even now, that the American market wanted something different, that there was a significant number of people in the United States who had ridden the domestic machines, respected them, and quietly wondered whether there was something faster available if they were willing to look across the Atlantic. Edward Turner, who was Triumph's chief designer and one of the most important figures in motorcycle history, had been thinking about this for years. Turner was the man who had designed the Triumph Speed Twin in 1937, a parallel twin engine that was lighter, more compact, and significantly faster than the single-cylinder machines that dominated the market at the time. The Speed Twin was a revelation when it appeared. It essentially defined what a British motorcycle would look like for the next 3 decades, and influenced engine design across the entire industry. By the late 1950s, Turner's parallel twin had evolved significantly. The engine had grown, the performance had increased, and Triumph was already producing machines that were competitive with anything else available. But Turner wanted something more. He wanted a motorcycle that would make a statement, something that would walk into the American market and make the existing conversation about performance completely irrelevant. The Bonneville T120 was that statement. The engine was a 649cc parallel twin, air-cooled, with a twin carburetor setup that was specifically intended to extract maximum performance from the configuration. The twin carbs were not a styling choice. They were a functional decision designed to improve fuel and air delivery to each cylinder independently and produce a power output that a single carburetor simply couldn't achieve at the top end of the rev range. Triumph quoted around 46 horsepower from the T120 in standard production form. In period, that number was serious. In the context of what American motorcycles were producing at the same moment, it was extraordinary. But horsepower numbers, as anyone who has spent time around motorcycles will tell you, only tell part of the story. The part that the numbers don't tell is the part about weight. And this is where the comparison with Harley-Davidson becomes genuinely illuminating. The Bonneville T120 weighed approximately 363 pounds in running order. That is not a light motorcycle by modern standards. By modern standards, it's a reasonable middleweight. But in 1959, and in comparison to what Harley-Davidson was building at the time, it was remarkably, almost shockingly light. The Harley-Davidson Duoglide, which was the flagship model from Milwaukee in 1959, weighed somewhere in the region of 670 pounds. The FL series machines of the same era were similarly massive. These were motorcycles built around an entirely different philosophy, one that prioritized feel and presence and the specific sensory experience of riding a large, heavy, low-revving V-twin over any performance metric you could measure with a stopwatch. That is a legitimate philosophy. I want to be very clear about that. There are things a heavy, torquey motorcycle does that a light, high-revving one cannot replicate, and those things have real value to the people who seek them out. The sound, the vibration, the feeling of all that mass moving with you rather than beneath you. These are not trivial things. They are why Harley-Davidson has survived and thrived for over a century. But when you put those two machines on a straight road and ask them both to go as fast as they can, the mathematics are straightforward and they are not kind to Milwaukee. The Bonneville, with its 46 horsepower and its 363 pounds, had a power-to-weight ratio that the Harley-Davidson simply could not match, not in 1959. Not in the 1960s. Not in many cases today when you compare an entry-level or mid-range Harley against a modern version of the Bonneville lineage. The British machine could reach 110 miles per hour in standard road trim. Some well-tuned examples went considerably faster. For a production motorcycle in 1959, that was a number that stopped conversations. The American motorcycling press, to their credit, noticed immediately. Road tests from the period describe the Bonneville in terms that mix genuine admiration with something that reads, in retrospect, like mild alarm. Words like effortless and authoritative appear repeatedly. Riders who had spent their careers testing American iron found themselves reaching for a different vocabulary when the Triumph was under them. The character of the machine was simply different in a way that was difficult to contextualize against anything else available in the American market. Here's something that I think captures the situation better than any specification chart. In the drag racing culture that was developing rapidly in California and the American Southwest during the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Triumph Bonneville became the motorcycle that everyone else was trying to beat. Not the Harley, not the Indian, the Triumph. When young men lined up at traffic lights or at informal strip meets to settle questions about whose machine was fastest, the British motorcycle was consistently the benchmark. The machine that won most often. The machine that everyone knew they had to beat if they wanted to be taken seriously. Johnny Allen had set a land speed record of 214 miles per hour at Bonneville in 1956 on a streamlined Triumph-engined machine. That record, and the name chosen for the T120 2 years later, was not subtle branding. Triumph was saying, in the clearest possible way, exactly what this motorcycle was about. And the people who bought it understood the message completely. The cultural penetration of the Bonneville during this period is remarkable to think about now. This was a foreign motorcycle, built in a country that most of its American buyers had never visited. by a company whose history they probably knew nothing about. And yet it became not just commercially successful, but genuinely iconic in the American market. It appeared in films. It appeared in the hands of people who represented a particular idea of cool, an idea that was, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, very much in the process of being defined. Steve McQueen rode a Triumph. Marlon Brando's character in The Wild One, the film that essentially created the outlaw motorcycle archetype in American popular culture, rode a Triumph. These were not accidents of casting or wardrobe. These were machines that had genuine cultural credibility because they had genuine performance credibility. The reputation was earned on the road before it was reinforced on screen. Now let's talk about what this means for the comparison with Harley-Davidson today. Because I said at the beginning that a 1959 Triumph Bonneville can still make a modern Harley-Davidson look slow, and I want to be precise about what I mean by that. I don't mean every Harley-Davidson. Milwaukee has produced machines over the years that are genuinely fast, and their more performance-oriented models in recent years have made serious power. The V-Rod, which used a Revolution engine developed in collaboration with Porsche, was a real performance motorcycle by any standard. The more recent CVO models are impressively capable machines. What I mean is this: the entry point to the Harley-Davidson range, the Sportster, the Street Series, the Iron variants that are sold as accessible and affordable entry points to the brand, these machines are not performance motorcycles in any meaningful sense. They are experience motorcycles. They are about a feeling, not a metric, and when you put one of them next to a well-maintained 1959 Triumph Bonneville T120 that has been properly set up and tuned, the Triumph wins. Not by a small margin. By a margin that would be embarrassing if the competition was taking the comparison seriously. The modern Triumph Bonneville T120, the current production version that sits in Triumph's lineup today, produces around 80 horsepower and weighs approximately 440 pounds. It is, in many meaningful ways, a direct descendant of the original machine, the parallel twin configuration, the twin carburetor aesthetic, now executed with fuel injection but maintaining the visual character of the original, the name. The fundamental philosophy that a motorcycle should be fast enough to genuinely excite the person riding it, not just fast enough to feel like it's trying. The lineage from 1959 to today is not just a marketing narrative. It is a genuine engineering inheritance. The decisions that Edward Turner made when he designed the original parallel twin, the decisions that went into the T120 specifically, created a template that has proven remarkably resilient. The basic architecture, 2 cylinders, parallel configuration, moderately high revving, relatively light, has been refined and developed and improved continuously for over 6 decades, and the result is a machine that remains competitive with almost anything at its price point in the current market. There's something worth sitting with in that fact. In an industry where technology moves at a pace that makes most products obsolete within a decade, the fundamental design language of a motorcycle built in 1959 is still producing world-class performance numbers in 2024. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because the original design was correct in a deep way. Not just functional for its moment, but structured around principles that remain true regardless of the era. The parallel twin configuration, specifically, deserves more credit than it typically receives in popular discussions of motorcycle design. It's easy to get distracted by the romance of the V-twin, the Harley-Davidson engine configuration that has become so culturally dominant that many people assume it is simply what a motorcycle engine is supposed to look like. The V-twin has real advantages. The firing interval produces a distinctive sound and feel that its devotees are entirely right to love. The configuration works well in a cruiser geometry. For the application it serves, it is genuinely appropriate. But for outright performance, the parallel twin has structural advantages that are difficult to argue with. The engine is compact and symmetrical in a way that makes chassis design easier. The reciprocating masses can be balanced more effectively. The configuration lends itself to higher revving without the vibration penalties that become significant in larger V-twin engines. And higher revving, all else being equal, means more power from the same displacement. More power from the same displacement means better performance without the weight penalty of a larger engine. Turner understood this in 1937. The designers at Triumph have continued to develop this understanding for every decade since. And the result, if you look at it clearly and without the cultural baggage that surrounds the comparison, is a lineage of motorcycles that has consistently outperformed the American alternative on the metrics that determine how fast something goes. I want to talk for a moment about what Harley-Davidson's response to the Triumph has been over the decades, because it's an interesting and somewhat revealing story. In the 1950s and early 1960s, when the British invasion of the American motorcycle market was at its height, Harley-Davidson did not fundamentally rethink its approach to performance. The company's response was primarily cultural and political, rather than engineering-based. There were efforts, some of them successful, to influence import tariffs and regulations in ways that would advantage domestic manufacturers. There was also a doubling down on the identity elements of the brand, the sound, the image, the community, that distinguished Harley-Davidson from its British competitors in ways that performance numbers couldn't touch. This was not a foolish strategy. In fact, in the long run, it was probably correct. Harley-Davidson is still in business. Triumph almost wasn't. The original company went into receivership in the 1980s, and the current Triumph is technically a different entity, a revival built in Hinckley rather than Meriden. The cultural strategy that Harley-Davidson pursued, the decision to compete on identity rather than performance, produced an enduring business in a way that pure performance focus might not have, but it also produced a brand that, for most of its modern history, has conceded the performance conversation entirely, has essentially said, "We are not in that race and we don't need to be. Our customers want something different, and we're going to give them that something different as well as anyone in the world can." That is a legitimate position. It is honestly held and honestly communicated. But it does mean that when you line a Harley up against a Triumph and ask which one is faster, the answer is almost always the same, and has been, with very few exceptions, since 1959. There's a broader point here about what we value in motorcycles and what we should value, and I don't want to be glib about it. Speed is not the only thing that matters on a motorcycle. Anyone who tells you otherwise has either never ridden slowly through a beautiful landscape or is performing a version of themselves that isn't quite real. The experience of motorcycling is richer and stranger than any performance metric can capture. The sound of an engine, the weight and balance of a machine beneath you, the feeling of community that comes from riding with people who share your specific enthusiasm. These things are real and they matter, but there's also something worth honoring in the pursuit of genuine performance, in the commitment to building something that is, by measurable standards, as fast as it can possibly be made, in the refusal to accept the limitations of what has been done before. The Triumph Bonneville T120 of 1959 represented that commitment absolutely. It was built to be fast before it was built to be anything else, and the performance it delivered, in its era and in comparison to its competition, was the result of engineers taking that commitment seriously. That machine, built 65 years ago in a factory in the English Midlands, is still making that argument today. Every time a current Bonneville pulls away from a stoplight ahead of a Harley-Davidson with a larger engine and a more famous name. Every time someone who expected American iron to be the benchmark discovers that the benchmark was set somewhere else entirely, a very long time ago, by people who have received less credit than they deserve. The 1959 Triumph Bonneville T120 was not just a fast motorcycle. It was a demonstration of what a fast motorcycle could be, articulated so clearly and so completely that the argument it made is still being heard. The name on the tank has changed in some ways, and the factory where it's built is different, and the technology inside has been transformed beyond anything Turner would recognize. But the idea is the same, the commitment is the same, and the result, when you measure it against the competition, is the same, faster. Still, after all this time, I'd really like to know what you think about this one. Whether you're a Triumph person, a Harley person, or someone who just loves the history of how motorcycles evolved and competed and shaped each other, drop it in the comments below. I read every one. And we'll see you in the next one. Ride safe.